Ukraine just carried out a huge strike inside Russia, and Putin is super pissed right now. You see, Putin was dreaming that if he threatened about launching nuclear missiles enough times, Ukraine would get scared and just back off and not use the US-provided ATACMS missiles. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Ukraine did the exact opposite thing. I guess Putin didn't realize that once you invade someone else's country, they tend to not care about what you want. Retaliation is the only thing you get in return. That's why Ukraine doesn't really care about Putin's nukes anymore. For the first time since the invasion started, Ukraine has finally used the US-provided ATACMS missiles. And they didn't just use it to target some low-value military assets. They've rained these missiles on possibly the highest value targets, the Russian army's ammunition depot and chemical plants. Here's more details on the strike.
Ukraine's military is calling overnight drone strikes on Russia one of the biggest attacks of its kind since the start of the war nearly 3 years ago. Moscow's defense ministry says Kyiv's actions will not go unanswered. It said Ukraine fired at least 146 drones, as well as US-made ATACMS missiles and British-made cruise missiles. Russian officials say they shot down all of the missiles fired at the Bryansk region. Well, for more on these developments, we're joined now by Jonah Hull, who is in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Jonah, Ukraine describing this as as one of the largest attacks of its kind. Can you, first of all, just put that into perspective for us?
Well, first of all, Ukraine, its military and its intelligence service now corroborating those claims that have been circulating for hours, largely among Russian military bloggers. You mentioned them. They're talking about this major drone and missile strike at military targets, military infrastructure in a number of Russian cities. Those bloggers also talking about Russia shooting down 200 drones, they said, as well as 6 US-made ATACMS ballistic missiles and 6 British-made Storm Shadow missiles. The Ukrainians not confirming those particular details, but the general military staff saying, as you said, that this is the most massive attack, their words, since the beginning of the war inside Russian territory. A number of cities targeted, infrastructure targets within them, ranging from between 200 and 1,100 kilometers deep inside Russian territory.
Now, of course, Russia is going to reject all these reports. They're going to say that they've stopped all the missiles fired by Ukraine. But we all know that in reality, that's not the case. Russia has been pulling this face-saving trick ever since the war started. Every time Ukrainians strike inside Russian territory, Russia just denies any reports of damages. Most of the time, they claim that they've shot down all the missiles in the air, but not this time. Because this time, after Ukraine struck inside Russia with ATACMS, the damages were so huge that it couldn't be hidden. The Russians themselves are posting footage of the attack on social media. Now, in a minute, I'll show you the leaked footage of actual damage that the Russian public is posting on Telegram channels. But before we get into that, let's first go over how this attack was the largest so far and why everybody's calling this attack the largest Ukrainian attack inside Russia. According to Russian Telegram channels, allegedly run by former KGB spies, Ukraine fired around 150 drones carrying US ATACMS missiles. When you take into account the number of drones used to carry these missiles, this definitely becomes one of the largest air attacks Ukraine has carried out. Another thing which reflects the magnitude of this attack is that while the attack was ongoing, Russia suspended flights at 9 major airports, and the strike also forced Russian authorities to close all the schools and colleges in the area. Russian Telegram channels leak that the strike caused huge explosions at ammunition depots and oil refineries. The missiles also targeted a chemical plant that was producing massive amounts of explosives and gunpowder for the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is claiming that this is by far one of the deepest strikes that they have carried out inside Russia, with targets being hit 700 miles inside their territory. Putin is super pissed right now, and what makes the situation even worse for Russia is the fact that this is the third night in a row that Ukraine has struck inside Russia. And since the Ukrainian missiles are now falling 700 miles deep into the Russian territory, things have now started looking way worse for the Putin regime. Now let's watch footage coming out of Russia from the attack site. First, we have a clip of Russia's Kazan chemical plant in Kazakh region going up in flames after getting hit with Ukrainian missiles. Now you must be thinking, where are all those air defense systems that Putin was bragging about? Because by the looks of the intensity of these strikes, I guess not a single Ukrainian missile could have been intercepted. But anyways, moving on. We have another clip from Russia's Bryansk region where Ukrainian missiles hit another chemical plant used by Russian military complex. Russia immediately claimed that they took down all the ATACMS missiles. But clearly, that's not the case, because the footage coming out of the attack site tells a whole different story. Now, the third site that Ukraine targeted was a Russian base. The Russian army was specifically using this base to drop glide bombs inside Ukraine. These glide bombs have recently targeted Ukrainian hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings, killing innocent civilians. So Ukraine finally destroying this airbase is definitely good news for the Ukrainian public.
The intelligence service saying that chemical plants were hit, refineries were hit, and significantly the Engels air base in the western Saratov region, its ammunition and fuel depots hit. The Engels air base, you may know, is the home to Russia's long-range bombers, the Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers, responsible for firing quite a lot of the cruise missiles that have for a long time menaced Ukrainian cities and Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So part of this effort obviously aimed at trying to impede Russia's ability to get those planes and their payloads into the air.
Now, after this attack, in a press release, Russia claimed to have shot down all the missiles fired by Ukraine. In the same press release, Russia also vowed to retaliate against Ukraine, and that retaliation came very quick, the very next day of the Ukrainian strike, in fact. But before we get into that retaliation, I just wanted to remind you guys how Russia retaliated the last time Ukraine used the America's ATACMS missiles. This was right after Ukraine got permission to strike inside Russia using American missiles, and after that, Putin got desperate and used his newest weapon, the Orshnik missile, to strike inside Ukraine. Now, this is where you can actually see the contrast between the United States and Russia. The thing is, if the US had a new weapon, they wouldn't just go around and waste it on a non-strategic target just to show to the world that they had something new. They would hide it for as long as possible and use it only when it matters most. But Russia, on the other hand, thinks differently. They had this new weapon called Orshnik, and they ended up using it on something that just didn't matter at all. They targeted some random, low-value Ukrainian sites. The damage was so little that the Ukrainian officials didn't even care to release a public report regarding the attack. Now, based on all the leaked reports from the Russian Telegram channels, the Russian army, while retaliating, could not hit any key sites in the Ukraine. They did not have the intel of any important targets that they could attack. The whole goal of using the Orshnik missile was to intimidate the world, especially the US, which had given permission to Ukraine to use their missiles in this strike. Using Orshnik missiles is just another way of Putin ringing the nuclear saber. He just wants the world scared. This strike was a clear message that Russia has nukes and is not afraid to use them. And that's exactly why, as soon as Russia struck Ukraine with Orshnik, the Russian spam bots and some top Russian official accounts started a whole PR campaign for the new Orshnik missile, saying that this is by far the greatest weapon the world has ever seen. Even the top Russian officials like Sergei Lavrov started claiming that the West has no air defense system that is capable of stopping Orshnik. And not just Lavrov, Putin himself was saying the same thing in an interview in front of the Russian audience. He was saying that the Western countries do not have any air defenses that can stop Orshnik. Now, contrary to this claim, the Ukraine military claimed that it was able to intercept some of the Orshnik warheads. So Putin's claim that the Orshnik can't be stopped is just not true. Putin's only goal is to put fear into the hearts of Western audiences. He understands that Russia cannot take on NATO on the battlefield. He needs face saving, so he heavily relies on spreading misinformation to win the information warfare. One prime example of this is this Russian general who's sitting on public television warning the UK that Russia is going to wipe them off the map if they give any more weapons to Ukraine again. Take a listen.
Великая. С чего она великая? И вот с этим островом когда-то раз навсегда покончим. Я уже про это говорил. Если кто-то считает о том, что если мы сотрем с лица земли Британию, и кому-то от этого станет хуже, в том числе и нам, не станет. Ответка прилетит? Не прилетит. Не прилетит. Потому по простой причине, что стратегические ядерные силы России сегодня в полной боевой готовности. РСМ в полной боевой готовности. Лодки можно вывести в районы боевого предназначения, они там спокойно до полгода могут находиться. Ничего им не мешает. Ну и стратегическую авиацию рассредоточить по аэродромах, А-55 со спецбоеприпасом, наверное, пора по 200. Чтобы не было желания. А вот орешником, теми же калибрами, мы вполне можем достать туда, и от этого острова ничего не останется. Ну раз и навсегда с этим злом покончим. Вот сейчас все говорят, переговоры будут. Будут переговоры. Да не вопрос. К примеру, без острова, да? От острова нет, и нормальные переговоры. Хорошая переговорная позиция. Вот, Андрей, да, когда образовался какой-то тупик. Слушайте, ребята, для нас тупика никакого нет. Я вообще не понимаю, зачем нам эти переговоры, когда мы сегодня побеждаем? Для чего они откровенно нужны?
But anyways, let's get back to the retaliation that Russia carried out inside Ukraine. The only goal of this retaliation was to get a bit of face saving. Russia is now realizing that it cannot win this war with NATO. Russia is currently losing over 1,500 soldiers a day while barely gaining any ground. On top of that, it's lost hundreds of miles of Russian territory to Ukrainian forces in Kherson Oblast. Things are looking bad for Russia on the battlefield, which is why Putin is on a killing spree of innocent Ukrainians. He's hoping that with these attacks, by killing innocent civilians, there will be pressure on the Ukrainian government for negotiations. Putin does not want to expand this war any further. He wants Ukraine to come to negotiations as soon as possible because Russia is losing billions of dollars every month. The country is facing the worst form of inflation, and Putin fears that very soon his own people will turn against him. Donald Trump coming back into power is another major reason why Putin wants to end the war now. According to General Kellogg, Trump's envoy for Ukraine, if Russia doesn't end this war, then the US and NATO can arm Ukraine to the teeth. Now that's exactly why Russia is very afraid to expand this war any further. Russia wants to negotiate with Ukraine and maybe try to come out on the better side of negotiations.
President Trump has said that if Putin doesn't agree to compromise, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth. And he will back them with all the might that the United States has. Well, let me state first, I think it's for the Ukrainians to articulate their own position. But let's do this. Let's set out a maximalist position from the Ukrainians. They would want all of their territory restored, including Crimea. They would want a pathway to EU membership, and they would want a pathway to NATO membership as quickly as possible. They'd want security guarantees if NATO membership wasn't available immediately until it could be available. And they'd want economic assistance to help rebuild their country. Okay, that's what we would like if an ideal situation. That is probably unattainable. So now the question is, what can you achieve realistically with less than that? And how much territory do you need to cede? Is EU membership on the table? How long will that take? Is NATO membership on the table? And how long will that take? And in the interim, are there any security guarantees? And again, how can you stabilize the border with Russia in the interim until Ukraine does become a NATO member? And again, all these complexities about how long the border is, who the peacekeeping forces are going to be, how you're going to verify it, what weapons are you going to allow Ukraine to possess, if that's going to be part of the negotiation also. Is there going to be basically zones of demilitarized? So yes, there's going to be a deconfliction point like the DMZ in North and South Korea, but is there going to be areas where neither side can have advanced weapons that could threaten the other? So again, lots of possibilities. The key is How can you make Ukraine more secure, more safe, and over the long term prosperous while maintaining its sovereignty so that this doesn't happen again in another 5 or 10 or 15 years?
Well, on that point, what would be your response, Ambassador, to the argument that a lot of Ukraine supporters make, which is that if there's any kind of negotiated peace that involves the long-term ceding of sovereign Ukrainian territory to Vladimir Putin's Russia, that the Kremlin will sell that as a win, and that in 5 or 10 years' time, some point down the line, it'll be back, be it in Ukraine or in the Baltic states?
That's right. That's exactly the concern. So how do you know that they just don't reboot and rearm and we have at this again? Where they attack Ukraine. And again, there's no guarantees, unfortunately, but there are things that you can do in order to make that less likely. And so this is where integrating Ukraine as much as possible into a security architecture that would deter Russia from aggression again is absolutely essential. And again, how you do that, what type of architecture, what the mechanisms are, what the timing is, that's really where the diplomacy is going to need to take place.